I can hear the rustle of the wheat fields blowing softly on the plain, and the tall pines of your northland make me want to come back home to you again, where a little woodland stream so swiftly runs. There's an understanding heart in every soul that dwells upon your gentle land, and the kind of hospitality that lets you help a neighbor when you can, where a man has room to see the setting sun. Saskatchewan, there's a hometown waiting there for me, with friends I've been away from far too long, and the yearning that I feel inside will never leave my mind till I am gone. So I'll see you once again before I'm done. Saskatchewan, I have traveled everywhere, from wide and ranging mountains to the sea, and I've never found a home that I will ever hear so fondly calling me. Get set to welcome home a native son. Saskatchewan, Saskatchewan.
Some of the story of Saskatchewan is so old that we can only guess at its details, but the beginning must also be told. So come over west and back millions of years to where and when it all began. Now it's best to remember that the events we'll visualize were never seen by man. This took place millions of years before man had come to Earth. The grand designer had bolder, rougher work to do at the time and had not taken time for things like human strengths and weaknesses. His stage was not yet set for man's arrival. Deep in the earth, an awakening began. At first it would have been an uneasy, sickish feeling. Then it grew to become an agony of gaseous pressures that built to a point of bursting. Gradually, and we don't know how long it took, there was a wrenching, twisting contortion until the earth's crust broke and a craggy, convoluted mass of rocky backbone was forced thousands of feet in the air. This split in the earth's crust, and the magnificent result of it was immense. It reached virtually from pole to pole. Now the grasping rocky fingers would forever change the pattern of two continents. First, they would seize the lowest, fattest, moisture-laden clouds and strip the wetness from them. Secondly, the peaks would cover themselves in the winter with hundreds of tons of snow and ice in a remarkable reservoir, storing in the winter when the plains below were asleep, and releasing in the spring and summer when the need was greatest. Well, here now begins Saskatchewan. In an alpine meadow at the foot of a tremendous glacier, the spring sun has begun the release of what is to become millions upon millions of gallons of water. It begins with a tiny rivulet that cautiously works its way across the meadow. Other rills and streamlets join in. Now, bigger and bolder, it begins its sparkling journey. Still other streams come to join and pursue their sunny release, and the more the sun, the more the streams. Now the water is wider and stronger and more purposeful. It strikes out down the eastern slopes, filling a crevice here, a gorge there, at times plunging with fearful force down hundreds of feet in white fury and then slowing to a more placid pace as it searches its way to the waiting prairies below. Always the pressure of countless millions of tons above it, the water goes on. Now finally in the low foothills, it continues at a more leisurely rate. Following each recession, it fills them to the brim, only to find a low spot along an eastern edge. Then another shiny finger of water leads the way eastward again. Farther south, the same story is repeated as untold millions of ribbons of water course together to form tiny streams, which in turn end up as thousands of creeks, which run into rivers, which course out into the plains and work their tortuous, twisting pattern ever eastward. Here, though, the water, by some geological trick, after fanning out in their separate ways, eventually come together again into one stream course. By now, the bigger Boulder River to the north has moved well away from its alpine beginning and has accomplished a more gradual, determined pace. The southern river, though, has suddenly come against a rise of land that has twisted its direction from easterly to northerly. A few hundred turns and a couple of 100 miles, and it has joined its northern sister to form one of Canada's largest rivers, and it continues on to eventually end in Hudson's Bay. Millions of years go by again. Now the rivers have well-established beds. Their shores are a haven to 1,000 species of furred and feathered beasts and birds. The grasses and trees on its banks are lush and heavy, and it is finally time for man to come. And just when the Indians came to the prairies is very hard to pinpoint. During the course of their wanderings, it's likely that many tribes came and went from the waters of the two rivers over many years before they settled to stay along their sheltered shores. Man's need for water dictated that the Indians live along the rivers. As the years passed, the Indian learned to navigate the streams with their frail craft, and thus the movement of tribe to tribe became easier. As much as water, the Indian was dependent on the animals of the plains for meat and clothing. It's likely that the buffalo herds migrating north in the summers led many different tribes to their shores. The wandering hunters eventually came to call the waters Kiss Saskatchewan, or swift-flowing water. Well, now another chapter in our story is complete. The mighty rivers have moved across the plains to provide the waterways and trading paths that will become so important, and the strange, haunting name of Saskatchewan has been established. The weather and the water that begins in the Rocky Mountains and moves eastward across Saskatchewan blew right into the face of the white man when he first came west. When it was all uphill, when all the currents were against him, what kept the early explorers on such a dogged westerly course? Well, I suppose there were Indian legends about a land of shining mountains, and even stories about a great western ocean out there somewhere. But more than likely, it was the same strange, curious desire that you feel following a strange road to see over the next hill or around the next bend in the river. Whatever the driving force, the white man came west, and he learned many tricks about the harsh new environment from the natives. Just one of the tricks he learned was to prove the beginning of a trade movement that has yet to end. The white man learned that beaver pelts made very warm and desirable gentlemen's hats. Well, after Sir Henry Kelsey, there followed a procession of equally famous explorers: Anthony Henday, David Thompson, Peter Pond, Fiddler, and 1,000 lesser known. They came with their colorful French-Canadian guides, the voyageurs, the coureurs de bois, and these men were soon to mingle with the natives, and often married Indian women, sometimes several Indian women. I mention this now because their progeny, the Métis or Métis, half white, half native, were to play their own special role in our province's heritage at a later time. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. There follows now a period that belongs to 3 different animals: man, the beaver, and the buffalo. Man possessed certain qualities: reason, logic, and vanity. Then as now, man liked nice things, especially to wear. This craving for a beaver hat swept through European gentlemen like a prairie fire. The market for beaver was unending, and then, as now, there were men who were prepared to go west and face hardships for the certain returns they knew would be theirs for a canoe load of beaver pelts. Now, the beaver is an animal with many virtues. He is an environmentalist, a surveyor, an engineer, and a builder. His broad, fatty tail, we're told, makes man a heartening soup, and of his soft, rich fur made wonderful gentlemen's hats. He, too, lives along the rivers, the two Saskatchewan rivers and the tributaries that run into them. So once again, the rivers became the homes of the fur trade. Fort Cumberland, it's over 200 years old now, became the first of the Saskatchewan posts. In fact, it's the oldest European settlement in Saskatchewan. Well, now begins the story of an incredible looting of nature. Some may well look back on this era with shock and dismay. Others will regard it as a time of tremendous initiatives and a justifiable pursuit of a desired product for an eager market. However it is viewed, though, it led to an amazing chain of events. There were two companies that desperately wanted to capture the fur market, the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Trading Company. The rivalry was keen, and it didn't take either company long to realize that the key to the fur harvest was the native. The key, once again, was man's vanity. The natives loved bright, shiny, ornamental beads and baubles, bright cloth, metal pots and pans, the white man's superior tools and weapons, and they loved his whiskey. They would trade furs by the stack for the favors of the white traders. They trapped relentlessly. More forts were built, more traders came west, more whiskey came with them, and more beaver pelts became gentlemen's hats. But other furs had value too: mink, ermine, marten, muskrat, and then suddenly there was a craze for buffalo hides. Now a new chapter opens: the buffalo hunters. The rifle was developed to a point of high efficiency by this time, and the hide hunters had only to have a generous supply of ammunition in order to fill his wagons with the hides of the great lumbering plains bison. The beaver may be nearly trapped out, but there were millions of buffalo, acres of them. They'd never kill them all. Get the Indians to help. Here's a brand new market. Well, sir, for all the hundreds of thousands of these great beasts, they almost wiped them out forever. Now, in this case, they had taken out a resource that the Indian had to have. The buffalo was food and shelter to the plains tribes. The Indian was dependent on the buffalo, but the buffalo was gone. Too late came the realization that now the Indian's culture and way of life was gone too. The proud Indian chieftains now were dependent on the newly introduced culture of the white man. Now the seeds of rebellion were sown. Remember our mention of the Métis and the part they had to play in our history. The stage was theirs now. They and their half-brothers and sisters now reacted to the white invasion of their land, their ways, and their livelihood. The rebellious Indians of the United States and the Canadian Indians and the Métis had a common grievance against the whites, and animosities began to grow. The hide hunters, and before them the traders, had inspired another trouble, the whiskey trader, and now the growing unrest was further fostered by the illegal actions of the men who dealt in booze. So there was now an urgent need for law and order. The Indian and Métis rebellion was on the rise. The whiskey trader was having a heyday. Just below the border there was outright war between the Indians and the white settlers. Then suddenly there was a murderous development on Saskatchewan soil known as the Cypress Hills Massacre. At long last, the government reacted to the long-felt need for law and order, and the Royal Northwest Mounted Police were thrown together, and they marched west. Well, it's a story of its own. 300 raw recruits, ill-equipped, green as grass, through uncharted wilderness, in the worst of weather conditions. Just how they held together is hard to figure now. But they did. From that agonizing, saddle-sore start was born the proud traditions of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Well, they hit right for the Cypress Hills and put up Fort Walsh. It's still there. Meanwhile, Chief Sitting Bull was on the run down in the United States. He and 6,000 Sioux followers had just defeated the proud American cavalry in the Custer Massacre, and they came into Canada to regroup. It must have been a nervous time for the handful of redcoats that manned Fort Walsh, but for 3 years they lived side by side with the fiery Sioux, and without so much as a skirmish, they helped persuade them to go on back home and surrender. There are just too many stories to tell about those early Mounties. There were so many things happening now. The Riel Rebellion was on the rise, as we've mentioned. Back east, the legislators were faced with 1,000 different problems. They were trying to put a whole nation together. The Americans were putting on pressure to grab off all of British Columbia. The nation needed a railroad right across it to tie everything together. The British North America Act was being drafted, and there were a mountain of other concerns. When you view it all in its proper light, the parliamentarians of the day really did a mighty good job, and the salaries weren't very high either. But there is a lot of criticism leveled at them about their handling of the Riel Rebellion. Oh, they won the day after some bitter fighting on Saskatchewan soil, but their failure to recognize just what Riel had tried so often to tell them was where the criticisms seemed justified. They turned a deaf ear to Louis Riel, and after convicting him in Regina of treason, he was hung on November 16th in 1885. Just 9 days after the first spike of the CPR Railroad had been driven in British Columbia mountains. Well, I've got to skim over some of these stories, but our province has a remarkably graphic record of the Riel Rebellion at Batoche, between Saskatoon and Prince Albert, and at Regina you can get ever so much history on the RCMP at the RCMP Museum. We have to move along with our story, because the events are beginning to pile up on us. By 1874, the great march west by the Royal Northwest Mounted Police had brought the law next to the territories. By 1882, the first train had arrived in Regina. The Riel Rebellion took place in 1885, and in faraway Europe, dreams were shaping in the minds of men who soon would become settlers of the territories. For years, the stories of a new world had provoked thoughts of freedom and land of their own among the peasants of Central Europe, as well as the curious and adventurous of Great Britain. Now, actual persuasion in the form of advertising and personal representation from the Canadian government reinforced the desires to embark for the new world. Well, it's unlikely that the full story of the harsh new land was told to the eager ears of Britain and the continent. The response was immediate and enthusiastic, and in a matter of months, the first immigrants were on their long journey to the new frontier. Many of the more prudent left their families at home, with only the father and elder son making the initial trip. But in other cases, possibly because of necessity, of the shortage of funds, or because of political or religious strife, whole families embarked with little more than the clothing on their backs. It is of these people that the most agonizing stories are told. They didn't know the language. They couldn't begin to imagine the sting of a prairie blizzard or the terrifying loneliness they would find in their faraway destination. They couldn't even imagine the grievous conditions they would face en route. They thought of a few days' voyage on a well-equipped ship. What many got instead was a ride through fierce Atlantic storms that took weeks in overcrowded freighters and cattle boats. Seasick and wretched from the long voyage, they came at last to the ports of eastern Canada. They were elated to feel a new land under their feet, but that soon turned to a new disappointment when they realized that thousands of miles of overland travel still lay before them. Picture the puzzled, weary faces of the Central European family as they listen with no understanding to immigration officials. Imagine, if you can, the concerns and foreboding in their hearts as day upon miserable day the overcrowded train rolled west. Out the grimy windows they saw nothing but rocks and trees and water. How they must have longed for the homeland, even with its trials, that had seemed so unbearable. Now can you see the chill in their tired eyes as finally the rattling train breaks into more open country and they begin to sense the terrible journey's end? At this time, our province was still only a part of the vast Northwest Territories, which included all of the nation west of Fort Garry, so the destination of the earliest settlers was not to Saskatchewan, or Alberta, or Manitoba, but rather to a surveyor's stake number. Well, all this changed in 1905, and this, the story of Saskatchewan as a province, begins there. Saskatchewan today is going to impress you in a number of ways. The vastness, the openness, the cleanness, the mile after mile of neatly squared fields, the acre upon acre of grain. If you fly over my province, you're going to be even more impressed by the immense acreage. It seems that the cultivation, the black fallow interspersed with the green seeded squares as far as the eye can see, makes you aware of the size in terms of work. All those acres worked and seeded every spring. In today's measurements, you'd think of an army of tractors and hydraulic farm equipment. Yet, what of the father and mothers of today's mechanized farmers? Well, they worked it with horses. And before that, not very much before that either, there had never been a plow point violate these same acres. You know, everyone should sit in a quiet part of a community pasture on native prairie wool and imagine Saskatchewan when it was in the 1880s to the 1900s. Not a farm light beacon in the darkness, not a windmill or a barn or an elevator on the horizon, not a fence line or a road to follow, just the prairie and the wind and the stars. And in the winter, the snow and the biting wind, and sometimes the blizzards. Oh, these reflections are taking us back only the short space of some living prairie folks' time. It's hard to grasp. What brought people to the prairies? Is there a breed of men and women among us today who would take on the hardship and the loneliness and the endless toil that the early settlers faced? If each generation produces its own pioneers, surely no generation produced so many, so able, and so strong as the pioneer stock of our prairies. Their story begins in 100 different ways and in almost as many countries. Some, like the Mennonites, came to the prairies to escape religious persecution. They were among the first. Some came for the promise of the freedom of ownership and the right of decision. Others were escaping political tyranny. In more cases than a few, they came to escape some part of their past. Others came purely for the adventure of seeing and settling in a new land. Whatever the motive, imagine the courage that man and wife had together to face the long, pitching, yawing, stomach-wrenching ship ride across the Atlantic, then the jolting, crowded, noisy, seemingly endless train ride to God only knew where, and finally to leave from Fort Garry or Winnipeg and head out on the final leg of the journey to what? To no home, to no neighbor that you knew, to no neighbor that even spoke your language in many cases. The final leg of the journey took them to a survey peg somewhere on the prairie, and that's where they began their new life together. By 1882, the trains brought the settlers to Saskatchewan. They were coming in numbers by now. And here I'm going to borrow the words of the eminent prairie historian Grant McEwen, quoting from his excellent book, A Short History of Western Canada. As the flow of land seekers increased, the gateway city of Winnipeg boomed. Its population reached 10,000 in 1881, and local people obtained their earliest vision of a great metropolis. Many of the newcomers halted at Winnipeg to buy equipment, horses, oxen, wagons, flour, and anything else likely to be needed. The Winnipeg merchants were delighted. In many cases, immigrants remained in ethnic communities where they could enjoy the company of their own people. The Cannington Manor colony, south of Moosomin, was the dream of Captain Pierce, who thought of it as a settlement in which Englishmen coming to the frontier might remain close to their own folks, living as Englishmen like to live, with time for cricket, fox hunting, and tea at 4 o'clock. The Pierce family arrived to take up residence in January 1883 and drove the 45 miles from Moosomin when winter weather was at its worst. The Bar colony at Lloydminster was started some years later, and it, too, was intensely English in character. Just as Cannington Manor attracted Englishmen and Gimli attracted Icelanders, the temperance colony in which the city of Saskatoon had its origin was for those and those alone who shunned strong drink. With the rising tide of settlement, it seemed that all countries in Europe and some outside Europe were represented. Many Jews came to Canada in the 80s, some of them settling in the West. Hungarians came to Manitoba in 1882, and 4 years later more were assisted by Count Paul d'Esterhazy in settling around the village now bearing his name in southeastern Saskatchewan. Germans found the West about 1890, some of them following Father Bruno and settling around Humboldt. Scandinavians became fairly numerous and proved excellent citizens. Settlers from the United States may have outnumbered any other nationality. Ukrainian settlers from southern Russia made their first appearance in the West in 1891 and came in larger numbers in 1898. They were the men in sheepskins, choosing parkland locations where they built thatched homes, outdoor ovens, and made various kinds of equipment to prove their resourcefulness. Also from southern Russia came the Doukhobors, who were pacifists and vegetarians. Some of the earliest arrivals were assisted by Count Leo Tolstoy and took land around the village of Verigan. In 1899, 7,000 came to what is now northeastern Saskatchewan. The most important date in the history of immigration and land settlement was 1896, when Clifford Sifton became Minister of the Interior and rose steadily to reach a peak of 400,870 immigrants in 1913. Not all the immigrants became homesteaders, but many did adopt the land. It must not be overlooked that even in the heaviest years of immigration, the United States was a big contributor of settlers. In the first decade of the present century, 44% of the homestead entries made in Western Canada were by immigrants from the United States. In this way, the West was settled by people of many nationalities, each bringing their own cultural distinctiveness, each finding fresh loyalty for their land of adoption. Well, pioneer resourcefulness began as soon as a settler found the survey stakes that marked out his quarter section. Naturally, you had to have shelter, and on the treeless plains, what do you build with? Well, every farmer had a plow, and it soon became widely known that the well-fibered prairie sods a plowshare could turn over could be stacked one upon the other to form a warm, tight house. If the Eskimo could utilize snow to make his igloo, so could the settler utilize the good earth to make his soddy. By today's standards, the sod shanty wasn't much, but it did afford protection from the wind and searing frost of winter. It was the rains of summer, though, that found the major architectural flaw in the construction of a soddy. Any rain worthy of being called a rain soon soaked through the sods on the roof, and the dirt floor was turned to a sloppy quagmire that would take days to dry. What was even more frustrating, the rain inside would often last long after the clouds had passed away, as the water seeped slowly through the by now sodden roof. Contrast today's modern bright kitchen to the pioneer soddy that was kitchen, living room, dining room, bedroom, and nursery, and often delivery room. Yes, more than a few of today's prairie families can point back with pride to a father, mother, uncle, or aunt whose first light of day was the dim, dank light of a kerosene lantern inside a soddy. Well, we do what we must do, and the pioneers made the most of their soddies until eventually they were able to floor them and then finally build a frame shack with a full, rain-proof roof. If childbearing and rearing and cooking, water hauling, sewing, and field work demanded the utmost from prairie women, so did the frustration and drudgery of breaking land and seeding crops that too often failed call on the inner strengths of the men. When crops failed, and there was nothing left to barter for staples, there were prairie chickens and rabbits, and thank God there were buffalo bones. The shaggy prairie bison played an almighty role even after his death, for the first settlers were able to glean a few dollars by gathering buffalo bones and carting them to the nearest railway pickup. As more settlers came, more trial and error solutions to the prairie's harshness were passed along. New immigrants from the Ukraine brought new ways to tame the fierceness of winter. New seeds, new ideas, and new markets began to slowly open new roads to modest prosperity. More neighbors reduced loneliness. Now settlements began to appear, churches, schools, picnics, dances, building bees, quilting bees, baby showers, weddings, all brought some relief from the mountainous workload. The fun of doing things together overcame barriers of language and cultural difference, and soon the district one hailed from in Saskatchewan gained as much loyalty as the old country did formerly. While old ties remained strong, there was a new and intense appreciation for the new land appearing. The devotion that early pioneers felt for their newly won land was surprisingly apparent when the call came across the land to arm for war in faraway Europe. Prairie boys and fathers by the thousands laid aside work only partly done to head for World War I. The role played by prairie soldiers in World War I is well known. The same courage and resourcefulness that was a stamp of the pioneer settler made Western Canadian soldiers the finest fighting men to ever carry rifles. Too many lost their lives in the 4 years of frontline battle. Too many widows and mothers were left to grieve and carry on alone. But they did. And finally, the grief lessened, and the clouds of war gave way to the urgency of rebuilding a war-tormented world and getting on with the job of settling Saskatchewan. The 20s were relatively good years for the pioneers. For the earliest among them, it was a time for consolidation and, in many cases, expansion. A great many of those huge hip-roof barns and square two-story houses that are still commonplace were built in the 20s. Roads, schools, churches, hospitals had by now become a part of the province's assets. Postal service had become highly efficient, and the catalog, the Homesteader's Bible, brought stories and pictures of the marvelous new inventions that were appearing almost daily. Inventions that were to take some of the drudgery out of housework. Scrub boards could be thrown away. The motor car by now was so common it didn't even cause many teams to run away anymore. The Model T, complete with its plume of steam from the radiator cap, was putting through the streets of every prairie town. Steam and gas tractors were able to break up new acres at a speed and with an ease that amazed the best horsemen of an earlier era. Prices were up, and farmers had formed the wheat pools of the prairies in an attempt to gain more control over the marketing of their grains. To most of the Western pioneers, it seemed that all their hard work had finally paid off. There was only sunshine ahead, no place to go but up. For just a moment, let's look at our province. Saskatchewan has nearly half of Canada's farmland. She grows roughly 2/3 of Canada's wheat. She maintains far more roads than any other province. She's rich in resources: coal, oil, potash, uranium, iron ore. Her potential for generating power is tremendous. She boasts the finest hunting and fishing of any place in North America. She's nearly half covered in freshwater lakes and rivers. She has produced many leaders of industry, politics, and literary fame. In sports, Saskatchewan has produced some of the nation's finest competitors. Her past history has been as spectacular as her future promises to be. And her dominant feature continues to be her remarkable ability to produce abundant grain crops. Well, how then has she become maligned and misrepresented as being an arid, featureless province? What could possibly paint her with such a picture of despair? Why does Saskatchewan, more than any other province, conjure in people's minds a vision of poverty and drought? Well, it happened in a desperate period of just 10 short years. The infamy of the Depression years, the Dirty Thirties, has been stamped on our province as indelibly as the taste of gritty dust is stamped in the memory of Depression farmers. First came the market crash of 1929. All markets everywhere shrank, but in Western Canada the bottom fell out of the economy, heralding the Depression, the Dirty Thirties, the Hungry Thirties, whatever its victims chose to call that decade of futility and poverty. Eggs sold at 3 cents a dozen. Pigs at $1.85 for 100 pounds. $8.50 was what you got for a cow, hide and hooves included. For 5 years, No. 1 Northern Wheat, backbone of the West, sold at Saskatchewan elevators for 20 to 25 cents a bushel, the lowest price in 3 centuries. There's many stories told of a farmer who bought a load of barley to the elevator, and after dockage and handling, he owed the agent $1. And he paid for that on his next trip into town in the form of a dressed chicken. Well, these happenings were not out of the ordinary during the Depression. Year after year, nature inflicted havoc in various forms on the young country's crops. They were ruined by an early frost in fall and hailed out the next summer. Clouds of huge grasshoppers reached plague proportions, stripping the fields bare. Another year the crops were lost to rust. Possibly the most nerve-wracking of the Hungry Thirties were the 5 years which saw nothing but wind and drought. The prairies became a dust bowl. The infernal grit in the air got into people's mouths, food, everything in the house. Lamps had to be lit at noon as the black dust filled the air. Wind erosion left only stones in the fields, blowing 6 to 8 inches of the topsoil away. 1937 was the year of the worst drought ever recorded on the prairies. No crops grew, and therefore no threshing was done. Instead, farmers cut and stacked the lowly Russian thistle to feed their starving animals. Later, thousands of cattle were sent to packing plants, and others went to feedlots in various parts of the West where grain and hay were shipped to the remainders. Land was impossible to sell, so thousands just left their wretched homesteads behind and headed for eastern Canada, or back to their homeland overseas, or north into the Peace River country. Others flocked into prairie towns and cities seeking work, but there was no work. Unemployment was everywhere. If you had $1, you were rich. Railroad men were laid off and remained so for years. A female clerk in a store was paid 7 cents an hour. And at $500 per annum, competition was keen for teaching positions. Young people were hardest hit as unemployment made it impossible to make a start in any field. The government provided relief in the form of hundreds of carloads of vegetables, apples, potatoes, fish, and cheese. The Maritimes, Eastern Canada, and BC also shipped carloads of foodstuffs to Saskatchewan and Alberta. And it was with some considerable humiliation that the immigrants accepted this government relief. Embarrassed at having to sacrifice so much pride, it is an act which few people have forgotten. However, compensation of a sort existed when, upon receiving food, clothing, and $15 a month, they no longer had to see their children barefoot, in clothes mended patch on patch, and living on eggs, milk, and lard sandwiches. Codfish supplemented the diet of the Westerner during the Dirty Thirties. Unfamiliar with preparing the thin, flat, salty cod for eating, they often served purposes other than for what they were intended. Some were used as shingles to mend the roofs of buildings. One bachelor claimed he had nailed one to a board, roasted it, and found he'd eaten the board instead. But there were those who never gave up the land. Sticking together in a way only Westerners can, they called it next year's country and firmly believed it, and they do even to this day. Ironically, 1930 marked the year W.A.C. Bennett became the first Prime Minister of Canada from the West. Well, his efforts at building the economy were hopeless, earning him the distinction of having a prairie conveyance named for him, the Bennett wagon. This was the result of taking the engine out of an old Chev or Model T Ford, which the farmer could no longer afford to drive, and hitching the rubber-tired wagon to a team of horses. But not even the dust and depression could break the iron-willed humor of the ones who stuck it out on their parched homesteads. Some of the words of an old song come back to me now as a reminder of the grim humor that adversity nurtured. Goes like this: but hurrah for Lane County, the land of the free, the home of the grasshopper, bedbug, and flea. I'll sing loud her praises and boast of her fame while starving to death on my government claim. My clothes they are ragged, my language is rough, my head is case-hardened, both solid and tough. The dough, it is scattered all over the room, and the floor would get scared at the sight of a broom. My dishes are dirty and some in the bed covered with sorghum and government bread. But I have a good time and live at my ease on common sop, sorghum, old bacon, and grease. Well, I don't recall all of the song, but there was a chorus that went like this: then come to Lane County, there's room for you all, where the winds never cease and the rains never fall. Come join the chorus and boast of her fame while starving to death on your government claim. Well, sir, perseverance and the wills that wouldn't be broken finally prevailed. The 30s passed, and the call to war once more echoed across the prairies. Terrible war that it was. It took a fearful toll of native sons to die on distant shores. And now fathers who had hoped for the help of growing sons had a new challenge. World War II saw a dramatic change in farming methods, and the productivity from farms in Saskatchewan verged on the unbelievable. Men and women who had planned on being able to rest at last shouldered new burdens and once again conquered the formidable job of providing the food for a world at war. Well, the pioneers, the rivers, and the soil. These are the beams the Saskatchewan story is built on. We cannot really honor the rivers or the soil, but we can, and we do, honor our pioneers. I don't know who penned these words, but they seem appropriate now. He sits in his chair with a thoughtful air, and he listens to wisdom flow. He lives in the present with those who are present, but he knows what they cannot know. Together they drink the ice-cool draught of sterilized limpid dew, but when he first came, he slaked his thirst 'neath scum from an alkalized slough. He covered the prairie's weary miles with only a trail as a guide, where trains now run from sun to sun and highways are many and wide. He is marked by years of toil and fears, the gamble with frost and drought. His face is lined and his hair is gray, but the same brave eyes look out. He sees the yield from the planted field, which makes him proud to know he toiled in the past with those of the past who struggled to make things grow. Well, sir, I haven't tried to tell the individual stories of settlers. There's just too many, and there are those who can tell them much better, because many live today who had first-hand experiences they relate so well. I do share this with you, though. I remember so well the hands of my father, cracked and weathered, often bleeding spontaneously as huge sinewed fingers bent to hook onto heavy jobs. Then, too, I remember those hands, tough enough and strong enough to manhandle a stubborn, hard-to-break cayuse, and gentle enough to smooth away a small boy's tears. Those rough, calloused, elegant spokesmen of 1,000 stories of the pioneer. Then there was the other pair of hands, so deft that a berry pail seemed to fill in an almost continuous flow, hands that could embroider a tea towel and sew back the button on a shirt. They dressed me warm, they fixed my hurts, they guided my path. You know, the story of our pioneers is all there, in their wonderful hands. So when you meet a Saskatchewan pioneer, be mighty proud to shake those hands.
I can hear the rustle of the wheat fields blowing softly on the plain, and the tall pines of your northland make me want to come back home to you again, where a little woodland stream so swiftly runs. There's an understanding heart in every soul that dwells upon your gentle land. and the kind of hospitality that lets you help a neighbor when you can, where a man has room to see the setting sun. Saskatchewan, there's a hometown waiting there for me, with friends I've been away from far too long, and the yearning that I feel inside will never leave my mind till I am gone. So I'll see you once again before I'm done. Saskatchewan, I have traveled everywhere, from wide and ranging mountains to the sea, and I've never found a home that I will ever hear so fondly calling me. Get set to welcome home a native son. Saskatchewan, Saskatchewan, Saskatchewan.